A lot of gardens stay half empty for years, not because the soil is bad, and not because the gardener is doing something wrong. Most of the time, it comes down to plant selection. Some perennials grow slowly, stay compact, or need constant replacing. Others quietly spread, fill space naturally, and make a garden feel mature much faster with far less work over time. In this video, I want to show you 9 perennials that do exactly that. Not the trendiest plants, not the rarest plants, just reliable perennials that steadily fill space, return every year, and help a garden look more established without constantly buying new plants every season. And I also want to show you something equally important: why some of these plants succeed so easily in certain gardens while struggling completely in others. Because in many cases, the difference is not the plant itself, it is where it is planted, how it spreads, and the small mistakes most gardeners never realize they are making. So instead of rushing through a huge list, we are going to slow down a little and look at what each plant actually does well in a real garden over time. And we are starting with number 9. Number 9. Creeping Phlox. This is one of those perennials that often looks unimpressive when people first buy it. Small nursery pot, low growth, not much height. But after a few seasons, it can completely change the way a garden edge feels, especially around rock walls, pathways, slopes, and raised beds. Creeping phlox is especially popular in Northeast and Midwest gardens because it brings strong color very early in the growing season. Right after winter, when most gardens still feel bare, this plant starts spreading into thick carpets of flowers, and depending on the variety, the mood changes quite a bit. Emerald blue creates a cooler blue-purple look. Candy stripe feels softer with pink and white flowers that work well in cottage-style gardens. And red wings gives a deeper magenta color that stands out beautifully against stone and gravel. One reason this plant fills space so naturally is the way the stems spread across the soil surface. As the stems slowly move outward, parts of the plant begin forming new roots wherever they stay in contact with loose soil long enough. Over time, one small plant slowly turns into a connected mat that softens hard garden edges. And honestly, that is where creeping phlox usually looks best. Not flat in the middle of an open bed, but somewhere it can spill downward naturally, along a retaining wall, a slope, or the edge of a raised bed. The best time to plant creeping phlox is usually early spring or early fall when temperatures stay cooler and roots can establish before summer heat arrives. And in humid climates, spacing matters more than many gardeners realize. If plants are packed too tightly together and moisture stays trapped inside the foliage, the center of the plant can slowly weaken over time. Usually the solution is simple: better airflow. Water lower near the soil, and leave enough room for the plant to spread naturally. Sometimes the plants that make a garden feel complete are not the tallest plants in the garden. They are the ones that quietly connect everything together. Number 8. Catmint. Catmint is one of those perennials that quietly solves a lot of garden problems without demanding very much in return. It flowers for a long time. It handles heat surprisingly well once established, and the soft gray-green foliage blends naturally with almost everything around it. In many perennial gardens, catmint works less like a featured flower and more like a calming connector between larger plants. The loose mounding shape softens sharp edges, fills awkward gaps, and helps nearby flowers feel less stiff or formal. And honestly, that relaxed shape is part of why so many gardeners keep using it year after year. The plant rarely looks overly controlled. Instead, it tends to spill outward gently, especially near pathways, stone borders, or sunny raised beds. One thing catmint seems to appreciate more than rich soil is drainage and sunlight. In heavy, wet ground, the plant can become floppy fairly quickly. But in leaner soil with steady sun and decent airflow, it often develops a stronger shape and blooms much more reliably. This is also one of those plants where overwatering usually creates more problems than underwatering. Once established, catmint often tolerates dry conditions better than many gardeners expect. In fact, slightly drier soil can sometimes encourage sturdier growth and stronger flowering. Another reason this perennial performs so well in many regions is the long blooming season. While some spring perennials disappear quickly after flowering, catmint often keeps producing waves of soft purple-blue blooms for much longer if trimmed lightly after the first major flush. But timing matters here too. Cutting the plant back too harshly during extreme summer heat can temporarily stress the plant more than help it. A lighter trim is usually enough to encourage fresh growth without forcing the roots too aggressively. In cooler northern climates, catmint often handles full sun comfortably all day long. But in hotter southern gardens, intense reflected heat near stone or pavement can sometimes dry plants faster than expected during midsummer. And despite the soft appearance, mature catmint is often tougher than it looks. The fuzzy foliage helps reduce moisture loss, pollinators visit constantly during bloom season, and deer usually leave the plant alone more often than many nearby perennials. One thing I personally like is how naturally catmint ages through the season. Early growth feels soft and fresh. Mid-season blooms create movement across the garden. And even after flowering slows down, the rounded gray-green foliage often continues adding texture quietly in the background. It's not the loudest perennial in the garden, but sometimes those are the plants that end up holding everything together. And for gardeners trying to build a calmer, low-stress perennial landscape that still feels full and alive through summer, catmint can become one of the easiest long-term choices to live with. Shasta daisies are one of those flowers that almost feel familiar the moment you see them. The white petals, the yellow centers, the way they brighten a garden without trying too hard. And in many home gardens, they quietly become one of the most dependable summer perennials people grow. But what surprises many gardeners is that Shasta daisies usually perform better when conditions stay a little simpler. Rich soil and constant feeding can sometimes create tall, soft growth that bends easily after rain or summer heat. Meanwhile, plants growing in leaner, well-drained soil often stay sturdier and bloom longer over time. From my experience, this is one of those plants that rewards restraint more than constant attention. The more people try to push rapid growth, the more floppy and short-lived the plant sometimes becomes. One thing Shasta daisies seem to love is sunlight and airflow. When crowded too tightly between larger plants, the lower leaves often stay damp longer after rain or morning dew. And in humid climates, that can slowly lead to weak stems or fungal problems that many gardeners mistake for nutrient issues. This is also why spacing matters more than people expect. At first, the plants can look small and sparse after planting. And I know it feels tempting to fill every empty space immediately. But over time, Shasta daisies slowly widen outward and create fuller clumps naturally if given enough room. Another interesting thing about this perennial is how differently it behaves depending on climate. In cooler northern gardens, many varieties stay upright for most of summer. But in warmer or wetter regions, taller stems may lean more easily unless the soil drains well and sunlight stays consistent. That doesn't mean the plant is failing. It usually just means the growing conditions are encouraging softer growth instead of stronger structure. Deadheading can help extend blooming for many gardeners, but even here, timing matters. Removing faded flowers too aggressively during extreme heat sometimes pushes weak new growth when the plant really wants a short rest. In many gardens I've seen, the healthiest Shasta daisy patches are not the ones receiving the most fertilizer. They're often the ones sitting in steady sunlight, decent airflow, and soil that drains before roots stay wet too long. And once established, these plants often become surprisingly resilient. Not perfect, not maintenance-free, but dependable in a calm, steady kind of way that fits naturally into long-term perennial gardens. Black-eyed Susan is one of those flowers that often looks effortless from a distance. Bright yellow petals, dark center, long summer blooms. It gives the impression that the plant can handle almost anything. But part of that resilience comes from something many gardeners barely notice. If you run your fingers gently across the leaves, they don't feel soft or delicate. The surface is slightly rough, almost fuzzy in some varieties. And from my experience, that small detail helps explain why this plant continues standing strong through dry summer weather. That thin layer of tiny hairs can help slow moisture loss when heat and wind increase during the afternoon. It's not a magic shield, of course, but it may reduce stress enough for the plant to keep functioning while softer plants begin struggling. In many home gardens, you'll notice Black-eyed Susan still holding its shape during long stretches of sun, even when nearby flowers start drooping by midday. And I think this is an important reminder for gardeners. Sometimes resilience in the garden doesn't come from dramatic growth or oversized blooms. Sometimes it comes from quiet adaptations that plants developed slowly over time. Black-eyed Susan also tends to perform best when gardeners avoid overhelping it. Too much fertilizer can sometimes push weak, floppy growth instead of sturdy stems. Rich soil isn't always necessary either. In fact, many gardeners notice stronger flowering in average or even slightly lean soil conditions. That surprises people at first. We often assume every flowering plant wants more feeding, more watering, more attention. But some plants are built for steadier, tougher conditions. And honestly, this is something I had to learn slowly in my own garden too. The more I stopped trying to perfect certain plants, the healthier they often became. Bee balm is one of those plants that instantly changes the feeling of a summer garden. The flowers do not look quiet or delicate. They burst outward in bright, messy shapes that almost feel wild compared to more formal perennials nearby. And honestly, that slightly untamed appearance is part of the charm. In many gardens, bee balm creates movement before you even notice the color itself. The stems sway easily in the wind. Pollinators circle constantly around the blooms. Butterflies drift through the flowers, while bees move from blossom to blossom all afternoon long. Sometimes an entire section of the garden suddenly feels more alive simply because bee balm is blooming nearby. But despite all that energy above ground, the plant itself usually performs best in conditions that stay fairly steady underneath. Bee balm appreciates moisture more than many drought-tolerant perennials on this list. Not soggy, constantly wet soil, of course, but soil that does not swing from soaking wet to bone dry too aggressively. In hot summers, inconsistent watering often stresses the plant faster than gardeners expect. And when that stress combines with humid air, another issue sometimes appears: powdery mildew. Almost every experienced bee balm grower has dealt with it at some point. That pale, dusty coating on the leaves can spread surprisingly quickly during warm, humid weather, especially when plants become crowded and airflow starts disappearing between stems. The interesting thing, though, is that mildew problems are often connected less to the flowers themselves and more to spacing, air movement, and watering habits. Many gardeners instinctively try fixing the issue with stronger fertilizer or heavier watering. But in reality, overcrowding is often the bigger problem. When bee balm receives better airflow, morning sun, and more stable moisture conditions, the foliage usually stays healthier much longer into summer. And honestly, I think bee balm teaches an important gardening lesson. Some of the most vibrant plants in the garden also need balance around them. Too much stress weakens them. Too much pampering weakens them too. The healthiest bee balm patches often come from simple, steady conditions repeated consistently over time. In a strange way, that feels true for people too. Russian sage is one of those plants that seems almost designed for difficult summer gardens. The silvery stems, the soft purple haze of flowers, the dry herbal scent that drifts through the air when wind moves across the foliage. Everything about the plant gives the feeling that it belongs in heat. And honestly, in many ways, it does. Some perennials survive summer. Russian sage almost seems to relax into it. During long, hot afternoons, when heavier plants begin looking tired or stressed, Russian sage often keeps standing upright with very little visible struggle. Part of that comes from the structure of the plant itself. The foliage is thin, soft, and slightly silvery, rather than broad and lush. That lighter leaf structure helps reduce moisture loss and excessive heat buildup during intense sun exposure. And the deeper root system also plays an important role over time. Once established, Russian sage usually handles dry conditions far better than gardeners expect. In fact, one of the most common mistakes people make with Russian sage is trying to care for it too much. Rich soil often creates floppy growth. Too much water can weaken the structure, and overly sheltered locations sometimes cause the plant to stretch instead of forming that airy, upright shape gardeners love. This is one of those rare plants that often looks healthier in conditions that seem slightly harsh. Dry soil, open airflow, strong sun. Even gravelly or average soil can sometimes produce stronger growth than heavily amended garden beds. But timing matters here too. Russian sage often wakes up slowly in spring compared to many perennials nearby. And every year, some gardeners assume the plant died during winter because new growth appears later than expected. Then suddenly, once warmth fully returns, the stems begin filling in almost all at once. I think Russian sage teaches patience better than almost any perennial on this list. Not every healthy plant rushes to prove itself early. Some plants simply wait for the conditions they were built for. And when those conditions finally arrive, they thrive quietly without demanding very much at all. Ajuga is one of those plants that quietly solves problems many gardeners struggle with for years. Not dramatic problems, not exciting problems, just those awkward, difficult spaces where grass refuses to grow well and bare soil slowly turns messy over time. Under trees, along shaded borders, beside pathways where sunlight only appears for a few hours each day. These are the kinds of places where Ajuga often settles in surprisingly well. And once established, it usually begins spreading slowly and steadily across the soil surface, almost like a living carpet. What makes Ajuga interesting is that it handles shade differently than many flowering ground covers. Some shade-loving plants become thin, stretched, and weak when conditions stay too dry. Others struggle when tree roots compete too aggressively for moisture. But Ajuga often adapts by staying low, compact, and close to the soil, where moisture remains slightly more stable. The dense foliage also helps shade the ground itself, and over time that can reduce moisture loss surprisingly well in partially shaded gardens. Of course, this does not mean Ajuga enjoys every condition automatically. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes gardeners make with Ajuga is planting it in areas with poor airflow and constantly wet soil, especially in humid climates. When moisture stays trapped around the foliage for too long, crown rot and fungal issues sometimes begin appearing underneath the dense growth. The interesting thing is that many gardeners first notice problems above ground long after the actual stress started below the surface. yellowing patches, collapsed centers, sections that suddenly thin out for no obvious reason. And often the issue is not lack of water at all. Sometimes the soil simply stayed wet longer than the plant wanted. This is one of those plants that usually performs best with moderation. Moderate moisture, moderate feeding, moderate shade. Ajuga rarely rewards extremes. And honestly, I think that is part of why the plant feels so calming in a garden. It spreads slowly, fills space patiently, softens hard edges without demanding constant attention. Some plants try to become the center of the garden. Ajuga usually does the opposite. It quietly makes the entire garden feel more complete. Karl Foerster feather reed grass is one of those plants that changes the feeling of a garden without demanding very much attention. At first glance, it almost seems simple. Tall, narrow clumps, vertical green blades, soft, feathery flower plumes that slowly rise above the foliage as summer begins. But once the wind starts moving through the garden, the entire plant suddenly feels alive. I think that is part of why this grass has remained popular for so many years. It brings motion into spaces that might otherwise feel heavy or static. And unlike some ornamental grasses that spread aggressively or collapse easily, Karl Foerster usually keeps a surprisingly upright structure through much of the season. One reason for that stability is the way the plant grows in dense, vertical clumps, rather than sprawling outward across the soil. The stems support each other naturally, and the narrow foliage allows air to move through the plant more easily during humid weather. That airflow becomes more important than many gardeners realize, especially during long stretches of summer heat combined with heavy moisture. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes gardeners make with ornamental grasses is assuming they require almost no maintenance simply because they tolerate difficult conditions. But even resilient grasses respond differently depending on timing and spacing. When clumps become overcrowded after several years, the center sometimes weakens slowly over time. Air circulation decreases, moisture lingers longer near the base, and eventually the growth may begin looking thinner or uneven. The interesting thing is that problems often appear gradually rather than all at once. A little leaning, slight thinning, flower plumes that no longer look quite as strong or upright as they once did. And many gardeners assume the issue is fertilizer, but sometimes the plant is simply asking for division and better spacing. Another reason Karl Foerster performs well in difficult summers is the root system underneath. Once established, the roots handle fluctuating moisture surprisingly well compared to many softer ornamental plants. Not because the grass enjoys extreme drought constantly, but because the structure of the plant is built to stay relatively stable even when weather conditions shift. That consistency becomes especially valuable in modern gardens where summers often swing unpredictably between heavy rain and dry heat. I also think there is something emotionally calming about vertical grasses in a garden. Flowers often attract attention immediately, but grasses change the atmosphere more quietly. The sound of movement, the soft, shifting texture, the way evening light catches the flower plumes near sunset. Karl Foerster does not try to dominate the garden. It simply gives the entire space a sense of rhythm and balance. Daylilies are probably one of the most misunderstood resilient plants in home gardens. People often describe them as easy plants, and in many ways, they are. They tolerate heat surprisingly well. They adapt to different soil types, and once established, they usually survive conditions that would stress many softer flowering perennials. But I think what makes daylilies truly interesting is not toughness alone. It is the way they balance resilience with recovery. Even after periods of heat stress or temporary drought, healthy daylilies often bounce back faster than gardeners expect. Not because the plant avoids stress completely, but because the root system underneath stores energy and moisture more effectively than many people realize. In fact, one of the reasons daylilies perform reliably for so many years is hidden below the soil surface. The thick, fleshy roots act almost like small underground storage structures. They help stabilize moisture, they store nutrients gradually, and they give the plant a kind of reserve system during difficult weather. That reserve becomes especially valuable during long, unstable summers. Sometimes gardeners panic when daylily foliage starts looking rough in midsummer. The leaves may yellow slightly, tips dry out, older foliage begins collapsing toward the base, and people immediately assume the plant is dying. But in many gardens, this is simply part of the natural seasonal rhythm, especially after flowering slows down during extreme heat. One mistake I see fairly often is overreacting with too much fertilizer or constant watering. From my experience, that sometimes creates softer, weaker growth rather than healthier recovery. The plant pushes fresh foliage quickly, but the structure underneath may actually become less balanced over time. And overly wet soil can sometimes stress the crown more than gardeners expect. Daylilies usually perform best when conditions stay reasonably steady, not bone dry for weeks, but not constantly soggy either. Moderate moisture, good airflow, and enough spacing for foliage to dry naturally after rain or watering. That balance often matters more than chasing aggressive growth. Another interesting thing about daylilies is how differently varieties behave from one garden to another. Some stay compact and tidy, others spread slowly into large, dense clumps over time. And climate changes everything. A daylily that thrives beautifully in one region may struggle in another with heavier humidity or warmer winter conditions. That is why observation matters so much in gardening. Not every problem needs an immediate fix. Sometimes the plant is simply responding to weather patterns the way it naturally evolved to do. I also think daylilies teach an important gardening lesson. Healthy gardens are not always the gardens that look perfect every single week. Sometimes resilience looks a little messy in midsummer. A few fading leaves, slight pauses in blooming, temporary stress during difficult weather. But underneath that slower surface, the plant may still be building long-term strength. And honestly, I think there is something reassuring about that. You know, the longer I spend in the garden, the less I believe healthy plants come from constantly pushing for faster growth. In many cases, the strongest gardens seem to come from balance instead. Not perfect conditions, not endless fertilizer, not non-stop correction, just steadier rhythms over time. And maybe that is part of what these plants quietly remind us every summer. Russian sage surviving difficult heat because of its lighter structure. Bee balm struggling less when airflow improves. Ajuga doing better when moisture stays balanced instead of constantly wet. Or daylilies slowly rebuilding strength underground even while the leaves above begin fading. None of those plants are trying to become perfect. They are simply adapting the best they can to the conditions around them. I think many gardeners underestimate how much long-term stability matters beneath the surface. Not only for plants, but honestly for people too. Sometimes doing slightly less becomes healthier than constantly interfering. Sometimes patience protects a garden better than another quick fix. And sometimes what looks like failure is simply part of a slower seasonal cycle we have not fully understood yet. From my experience, gardening becomes far more enjoyable once we stop expecting every plant to look perfect every single week. Because real gardens are alive. They change constantly. They respond to weather, stress, recovery, age, soil, timing, and countless things we cannot fully control. And strangely enough, that may be part of what makes gardening feel meaningful in the first place. If this kind of slower, honest gardening conversation feels comfortable to you, feel free to subscribe and spend more time with us here at VTA Garden Tips. And as always, if your own garden has taught you something different over the years, I'd genuinely love to hear your experience in the comments below. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of your garden slowly.